Lorien Gremore, Director of Project Management for Platform from Wargaming, United States, with the speech on connecting strategy and execution. Lorien, welcome.
So, here we go. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you today about connecting strategy and execution. And the reason I'd like to talk about this is that game development projects are getting bigger and more complex all the time. And this is the context for why strategy and execution often get more distant and disconnected in the process of game development. So let's start with where I started, with MUDs, basically text-based MMOs. We started with one programmer, a few content designers, and a product manager back in my day, and we had never heard of a Gantt chart back then. We were limited basically only by what we could imagine and what we could write about. Fast forward to today, and you'll find that the complexity, scale, and diversity of gameplay drives a tremendous amount of pressure on game teams to create richer feature sets, more penetrating marketplace experiences. And what we're definitely experiencing more of is the idea that we have to create more faster at all times in game development. So the problem with this is that user stories tend to become too abundant, dependencies become too dense, and the pressure gets too great. So the old methodologies that we used to manage projects when things were a little bit simpler might not be as effective anymore. And the result tends to be unpredictability. We lose the innovation because we run out of time for innovation. We spend not enough time doing the right work, and so we don't have enough time to really have the freedom and trust to go ahead with our own ideas. So in order to understand what we're talking about here, we have to talk about the reality of game design and vision encountering the real world. And the reality of games right now is that we are often sprinting towards a cliff, burying a Gantt chart in the drawer 5 minutes after we've made it, understanding that our teams are probably not going to reach the milestones that we've set for them. The root of this is often doing the wrong work and spending too much time on that aspect of our projects, without the understanding that if we could stop, take a moment, and put our efforts towards finding the right work, we might find ourselves able to put more time against our projects. So this is the core of the strategy. Good leaders ensure that the right work gets done. And they are champions for sanity on projects that are increasingly chaotic. Getting the right work done is more than the dream. It's what we need to be able to hope for as leaders more than anything. And connecting strategy and execution means committing daily to becoming a compass for your team, navigating to find the right work. I'll be talking about some practical techniques towards this goal. And these 5 approaches build on each other. We have find the missing link between strategy and execution. We have making big work feel small, making small work feel big, inspect it and adapt, and stop making decisions. I'll save that one for last. The subject tends to be dry as well, so let's use an example. Catmatch. It's my imaginary company where you find the perfect feline companion online and can search detailed profiles and interview cat companions. Now, this is a company that in my imagination has been in America for a while, but it's going international now. So, the boss has declared that we're going global and given an inspirational speech. Press releases have gone out, and the dev team is cautiously optimistic. In fact, let's say that this company has a pretty smart leadership team, and they've set a combination of high-level vision, unite people with their perfect cat anywhere, and goals, more strategic understanding of the roadmap for growth in this company. They have identified that we need to add 200 new shelters to the network internationally, support 5 new languages, and establish efficient transport to 20 new metro areas. This is all good. And they have a team that has done this before, a bunch of good experts. They've done it on a smaller scale. They're able to hire really well. What could go wrong? So let's start with the core driver of the approaches that I'm talking about today. This is a key element in the rest of the approaches, and it centers on the problem. Vision too large fails to direct or motivate teams, and goals too specific stifle engagement. These are 2 big ways that big projects can lose momentum. Scaling up the product or project vision can turn an end goal that used to drive and inspire and rally a team into an idea that's so broad and generic that no one can take it seriously. Or it can go the opposite way, and you can end up burying your team in a massive avalanche of specifications that no one can actually process anymore. These 2 aspects are, of course, part of the direction of any project, big or small. Strategy and execution get at providing vision, challenge, and inspiration at the strategic level, and design, specification, and feedback at the execution level. So benefits of a layer in between is what I'll talk about here. And that layer, for the use of this presentation, I'll call tactics. A tactical project layer can provide a few benefits that I'll categorize here. Focus, we understand and believe in where the project is going. This is the voice of the team speaking. Freedom means we are empowered to make decisions at the right level. And connection means we feel our contributions are meaningful inside the project and beyond. Now, if you come from a game design background, these might sound pretty familiar. These are also what we use to map player motivations, intrinsic and extrinsic player motivations, a lot of times in game design. And I'm using a very similar set of qualities here because the same type of motivations drive game developers. We need more cultivation of these qualities in large projects. Let's delve down a little bit deeper on focus. So the competition for focus in a large project is incredibly immense. And so one of the roles that a leader can have in this situation is to break down vision towards directive solutions. But at the same time, just as I showed before, it's important to avoid going too deep on implementation details before the understanding is had of what the tactical value is. So using the tactical layer as a place to explore potential solutions is an important part of this. I like to use the term outcome-based and specific when we're talking about the importance of the tactical layer in providing focus. Freedom is a difficult thing to give in large projects because we have the tendency to over-direct people. There's some project management poetry that I like, which says that if you wish to build a boat, do not teach the men to hammer nails and chop wood. Instead, teach them a love for the vast and endless sea. And maybe that's a little bit too much freedom, because you might end up with a bunch of people standing on a beach. But the principle is sound, and we need to have that freedom and flexibility in order for the experts on our team to be able to apply their knowledge and their skills and talent. So it is important to craft the direction to be both flexible and empowering within appropriate constraints. Finally, connection. We want to provide direction that is meaningful and collaborative so that people feel connected with the big picture and also with their fellow contributors. We use tactics to align teams. It might be teams of developers and product stakeholders, or it might be teams of disciplines. In any case, tactics are a common language that can help us to move forward together. And it creates a context for discussion and feedback so that we're all talking about the same type of thing, we're on the same page, we can actually understand each other as we move through this. So, to return to catmatch, let's say that their goal is to efficiently deliver cats to 20 new metro areas. There are many potential interpretations of that goal, and so when you end up with many different interpretations, you are potentially spending time on the wrong thing. The tactical layer can help us to narrow down, focus on what's potentially most valuable, helps us to define the value proposition to start with, and begin from an experimental standpoint to explore whether, in fact, each of these solutions is potentially the right one to achieve our goal. So perhaps it's air transport, plane transport, and ground transport. Tactical solutions start minimal. There needs to be enough to define the opportunity and engage the developers, but before we actually apply development resources, tactics need a basic test phase, an implementation that is as minimal as possible to explore the idea. Let's imagine that we are testing different parts of the hypothesis that the product manager or producer or designer or any of the stakeholders in the situation are proposing. And we are finding that pieces of it work as well as we expected or not as well as we expected. They are continuously evaluated throughout the process. And as we find that some things don't work so well, let's say perhaps that cats get seasick, we deprioritize them and we put our investment against the things that are working better. Again, the tactical layer enables us to do this before we have begun to explore a lot of technical implementation details, but gives us the opportunity to shelve something that is not working and prepare for the execution stage with more confidence. So the word tactics that I've used here, I've used mostly because it's a bit of an abstract, but you might call it epics, you might call it solutions, you might call it plans. Depending on your development methodology, it comes by many different names, but the experiments we're talking about here are about creating MVPs or early iterations or prototypes. Whatever your method, this framework can apply, and it takes us from the strategic layer to an intermediate layer that enables us to potentially stop doing the wrong work before we start. Another way to think about the tactical project layer is in terms of how and why. So from the top down, the tactical layer applies an understanding of the practical approach to a goal. How are we going to do this? It also connects stakeholders, again, designers, producers, product managers, to the work. It also has a bottom-up value, which is why. So for contributors, this helps to answer why are we doing the work. It connects them further to the goals and explains the purpose. So to build on the starting point there, this is closely connected with tactics, but it's a bit more psychological, making big work feel small. Large teams can be demotivating atmospheres. It changes. Small teams often feel a little bit more familial. There might be a much more healthy team culture in a small team. And while we cannot create culture, we can help to shape it. And one of the things that we can do, particularly is put a lot of effort towards restoring the feeling of a small team development culture on larger and larger projects. So, a dedicated and dynamic team tackles big projects with small team cohesion. Cohesion is the key word for me here because it talks about what we often lose when we're working on those big projects. A great team culture takes goals to heart and embraces adaptation, but they can only do this if they understand the connection between their work and the strategy. So these qualities can help us navigate challenge and complexity and make use of direction appropriately, but they can only do so if we are able to foster them. So the idea here is fighting isolation. It might seem counterintuitive that larger teams feel more isolated, but individuals often do. Individuals often feel like they are less connected with each other, less connected with their purpose. And so one of the things that drives it, I think, is the loss of a shared context and a shared purpose to work within. So we're trying to fight isolation here by recreating the familiar qualities of a project. So bring people together, host events that people care about. If your team is local, enable them to perhaps participate in volunteer opportunities together, or give them an opportunity to mix outside of working hours, or set up your studio in such a way that they are compelled to work together a little bit more. If you have remote teams, it's harder. It will always be harder, but investigate your telepresence options. Realize that the investment in that level of passive and casual contact will actually probably pay off big in the future. So one of the things that we can also say is that you cannot repeat your objectives too often. The objectives have to be very clear to everyone, and it has to be in a language that can be shared. So when we all talk about it, when we get together large teams or teams across multiple disciplines or locations, if they can all share a common understanding of their purpose, they will have a much easier time relating to one another and feel more cohesive about their overall work. Finally, the connection to business is a controversial one. A lot of teams don't feel like they can get at the truth of what the business is doing, what the financial goals or targets might be. And a lot of companies feel like they can't share that with their teams. But it's an interesting exercise, and it builds trust between teams and leadership if you feel like you can do that. A lot of teams feel very motivated by the idea that they can head towards a particular set of goals, almost like a scoreboard. And it does have the sense that we are working towards this common purpose together, and breaks down the isolation in that way. And finally, leaving space for innovation is an important piece here. We have a tendency to over-direct the work, and we exhaust great people. If we can plan time for the undirected work, we will more likely retain the people who are innovators in our systems. So, leaving space for innovation may feel expensive, just like telepresence such, but it really can be an incredibly valuable addition to your team's culture. And create mutual respect among team members as well, because they can actually see each other's passion for the project. Let's go back to catmatch. So, as it is, the people who come to a cat matching company probably feel very passionately about cats. And perhaps they had a healthy cohesion once upon a time when they were a smaller company. Breaking down under the pressure of complexity is something that happens pretty naturally in big projects, especially ones that grow quickly. So perhaps some of the approaches they could try would be video conferencing their daily scrums between remote teams so that there's a real presence in each of those meetings. Perhaps weekly demos where individual team contributors demonstrate the results of their work and discuss problems or successes they've encountered together. Perhaps the company sponsors volunteer projects at local shelters. Perhaps there's monthly town hall meetings to make sure that there is a constant ongoing reaffirmation of what the team is about and what it is for. Specific financial and net promoter score targets possibly could be shared regularly to enable the team to talk more specifically about where they are against their goals. And if you can carve out the time for it, quarterly innovation camps start to get us towards that feeling of being a smaller, more startup, scrappy style team without having that be the focus of the development work. So next up, making small work feel large. We've looked at trying to make a project feel smaller, but projects are big, and individuals can begin to feel insignificant in the context of those very large projects. And this is, in a way, correct, because we cannot allow individuals to be critical in projects beyond a certain scale. It's irresponsible to have a single point of failure in your project. So this is our reality. But how can that affect us psychologically, and how can we correct it? Roles are also increasingly operational in game development projects these days. There are live services or maintenance or essential services. And those roles are often seen as traditionally less exciting than the core game development roles. So we need to amplify the feel of importance and impact to counteract the feeling that your work is getting smaller and smaller. Passionate people need to feel not just connected, but recognized. And so let's look directly back at catmatch, just for an example. One of the things that I've seen work well is peer-to-peer recognition awards. Given on a regular basis, these can create a habit of team members looking out for good things that their cohorts are doing. And it is a chance to recognize the ability of team members to contribute and help each other. So I think that this is a really positive addition to any retrospective. Also, time reserved at every all-hands to recognize new development and live maintenance equally. We often forget about the importance of live maintenance when we're talking in sort of internal marketing speak. And so it is especially important to consciously make that preparation and enable the team to have the pride, the same pride perhaps, that the core development teams might have. Also, speaking openly about how live and back-end teams ensure the financial stability required to innovate. This is an important point to make again and again to remind the teams who are generating this technology as much as anything that this is an important key part that enables the rest of the company to work on the newest and perhaps most exciting pieces of it. And it enables us to say that without that type of work, innovation is truly not possible. There's also a need to empower service teams to say no. In a lot of projects, it becomes a stack of work that is simply shoveled onto a live service team or essential service team. And it is almost always expected that there is no way to say no to these projects. This is not true, and service teams need to have the inherent respect given to them to acknowledge that they are also good at evaluating value, they have a particular bandwidth of work as well, and they have many customers that they need to be able to prioritize. So, giving those teams the empowerment to say no is both a message to those teams that they're valuable and important, and also a practical sense for where the business actually has to go. We have to be able to limit what we work on because we're never short of good ideas. So, inspect and adapt is a very familiar Agile principle, probably to most people, but I think it needs more attention as a project management mantra. It is your score multiplier. It is how you move from the grind to the end game. This is the importance of learning constantly and applying that learning consistently. So let's look at some of the techniques. Inspect or learn about your project by doing retrospectives. But dev retrospectives often focus on incidents, and so it is incumbent upon leaders to steer towards root causes, process, and also to demonstrate enthusiasm for the concept of truly looking at what your work what results were. So embrace the retrospective and show that you are embracing your retrospective to your team so that they have the same enthusiasm for looking at and learning about how they've worked. Listen actively, whether it's in a group or one-on-ones. It is necessary to create safety during the feedback process. So take an interest, seek insight, ask questions, practice the active listening techniques that you'll find in a lot of books. But most of all, be always driving towards something that is productive out of criticism or accolades. And if you're not getting much feedback, change the collection method, because there never really is a lack of feedback. There is only a lack of collection of feedback. So if you are not getting the feedback that you need, perhaps you need to try an anonymous form. Perhaps you need to give people a chance to put in their recommendations ahead of time. If asking in the moment isn't working, try working with smaller groups. And second part of inspect and adapt is to always be applying those lessons. So identify actions that correct the issues and repeat benefits. Take action in collaboration with the team, but also from those who are outside of the team. I think it's very interesting to add to the mix the ability to access peers who you could brainstorm with, or people who may have gone through a similar process themselves and have best practice recommendations. Also, don't apply too much at once. Limit the number of actions you take per cycle. Prioritize in cooperation with your team. And also, you will build trust by delivering on the actions that you take, whereas you will break trust by taking on too many actions and not being able to deliver on them. And finally, observe and discuss. Of course, the actions that you apply have to be studied, reviewed, and shared if they are successful. So for instance, catmatch, perhaps, has globalization pains. It might be that their first retrospective is a little bit contentious, and the translation team doesn't turn out to be online when we need quick fixes, regional payment processors, or fee gouging. This type of thing is the typical amount of retrospective feedback that we get. And the important thing here is to dive a little bit deeper. So apply some active listening. Guide your team towards the root causes, and perhaps refine the feedback as you go along. And perhaps at the same time, find your way towards an eventual solution. Just saying. So perhaps this feedback all leads you towards a certain set of actions. A temporary video moratorium, running split shift with the translation team, things like that. So you might end up with this overwhelming list and need to drop a few things, shelve them, keep them for later, find your particulars of a highest priority nature, and shelve the rest for a little bit later. I want to move on to stop making decisions here because this is a pretty controversial subject, but you might have heard of it before in leadership circles. Building and maintaining a strategic to execution connection is a very big job, and we need to focus on it. We need to give it the time that it deserves and that our team deserves. So we can focus more on this need by entrusting the specialists who are on our teams to make more of the decisions that matter. Now, people who are in production roles or project management roles are often multi-talented, and it can be very tempting to range back to our specialties. But when projects grow, our specialty needs to be leadership, and we need to concentrate on it in a very meaningful way. So I'll admit, first of all, that I don't mean all decisions. You don't have to stop making every decision. Some decision-making is inherent in the role of a leader, but we often add responsibility to ourselves as we scale up here, and empowering the individuals on our teams so that we can spend more time on tactics is the better approach. They need to feel like a part of the bigger picture, the team members. And if they can influence direction, they are even more connected to the strategic elements that the big team has made them feel distant from. Does this mean shirking your duties as a leader? It's probably a matter best discussed with your therapist. But honestly, I can say that the benefits of this can be quite surprising. So push responsibility to the level closest to the problem. And this means identifying those people who are closest to the problem and setting clear expectations for the outcomes you need from them. This is defining expectations, but it's also defining a role. Defining a role in the authority and accountability language can be very useful here. So it boils down the role to its essential elements, and it makes it a little bit more tangible. An example of role authority might be the power to decide over when a build is released, and the accountability might be defined very simply as the stability of builds that get released. These can be built up and can become fairly complex, but it's useful to limit it to the space of a role. Someone might play multiple roles on your team and might collect multiple authority and accountability pairs. You might even write them on cards and trade them around, as the necessity is for sometimes other people to pick up roles and for them to be transferred among each other. If all of this sounds very uncomfortable, that's pretty natural. You might try an approach where you trust but verify, where it is an opportunity to delegate responsibility to a team member, a specialist, but also have a system of notifying you of decisions. It prevents you from becoming a bottleneck, but maintains your awareness of what the team members are actually deciding and gives you a chance, if necessary, to make a stop on things. But it also builds up that trust, because I'm going to bet that what you find in all of this is the opportunity that the team members needed was simply needed to be offered by you. So finally, the focus aspect of this is back again to needing to serve your team's needs. Again, we often extend ourselves beyond the needs of our team, and we disempower them by taking away responsibilities that they could have held and delivered very well by themselves. I'll give you an example of an unexpected lesson in letting go that I got. In March of 2013, I was 3 months from going on maternity leave, and I believed that I was way behind in my ability to hand off the level of responsibilities that I had to my team. And it was on a Tuesday after sprint planning that I suddenly nearly died. You might have felt like that after sprint planning yourself at some points. And I ended up with a 2-pound, 11-ounce baby that afternoon. And so nothing realigns your priorities like suddenly becoming a parent. But I still felt very worried about my team. I worried that I hadn't left them with enough instructions for doing deployments the way that we usually did. It was a live operations team with a large player base. And so one day, on the next day that I knew we were doing a live deployment, I went to the hospital and I set up my laptop and I VPN'd on Slack and I checked in on my team to see how deployments were going. And it turns out they were very surprised to see me, and I was very surprised to learn that they were basically done with the deployment. It had turned out that an engineer had taken on the responsibilities of finding the configurations and setting up all of the sign-offs that I had needed. And there had been a producer who took on the communication roles and a QA person who took on all of the checkoffs that we needed. They had self-organized. They had found their way through what was clearly a big lack of documentation on my part because I hadn't been prepared. And they continued to do it. Even when I came back, they were always responsible for that from then on because they enjoyed it. It was actually part of the pride that they took in their team at that point. And so if there is a lesson that I took away from this, it was that I had assumed that I was protecting my team from work that they didn't want. But the truth was I was taking away from my team an opportunity to own part of their project that they actually thrived on owning eventually. So there is so much benefit, I think, that you can get from extending the trust to your team. And we have to ask ourselves a question as leaders. When I'm doing something to try and make life easier or solve a problem for my team, am I really the best person to do that? Have I perhaps not noticed someone who is actually waiting for a chance to prove themselves in that role? And what value can I bring that is actually unique as a leader? And how do I make it no longer unique so that I can retire and drink margaritas on a beach? Well, back to catmatch. Just to summarize, navigating the expansion of a project and keeping it sane takes an evolving set of leadership skills. Find the right work, define your tactics, cultivate a small team culture if you can, make the work meaningful, learn, apply, and focus. I hope these approaches give you some ideas for your own situations. Keep learning, keep teaching, and have fun. Thank you. To the translator as well, I guess.
Вопросы также можно задавать по-русски.
You can ask questions in Russian if you want.
Really engaging talk. I appreciate your time. I think I made some notes here. You said on the make big work feel small. There was a comment you made about team culture and that you can't create the culture. I wonder if you could expand upon that for us, please.
Yeah, I think that I have encountered that before in places where we particularly had a strong culture and we saw it diminishing, and we asked ourselves, why did it diminish and how can we recreate it? And we decorated the office and we sent out lots of swag with company mottos emblazoned on it, and it never really got to the point that it was before. And so what we ended up doing was we had a big offsite with Leadership Summit, and we asked ourselves what it was that to our minds made it a good place to work or an inspiring project to work on. And when we were able to realign towards that direction, I think that some of the answers became more apparent, and they weren't as superficial as we were thinking about them from, because even though if you asked an average team member just like, what was it to work at that company, they could say fun, they could say engaging, they could say that we were focused on the player and it was good. But unless we were living those practices day to day, and really exposing our team to how we were living those practices, we weren't getting at the real heart of the issue. And so I think it was a realization that we made back then that communicating with the team was a major element in the process of shaping culture, but you could still never make a culture. You could never define the constraints or shape of a culture entirely, but you could guide it in several ways, especially by making the conversation that people had about the company a particular set of contexts, such as we are committed to gameplay testing in a very meaningful way. Look, we are bringing in the people. You can talk to them. We are going to interview them. We have a very open culture around what the gameplay evaluation actually is, and we see the results of that on a daily basis. That starts to change the culture and realign it, but I don't think that we can ever set the culture, even to bring it back to where it might have used to be.
And this was a great question. You have earned your sticker. Yay!
No.
Who wants to earn another sticker?
Lorien, for a very interesting presentation. I'm Kimmo Kari from Finland, from Rival Games. The question, I try to formulate in my head, I want to ask about trust and about feeling safe to fail, because that is actually a really important thing, at least in the games industry, because the competition is just so fierce that you have to be a bit innovative to differentiate yourself from the competitors, and innovation is always risky. So
Yeah, for sure.
So how to encourage team members to take more risks, and how to be a leader. And what are your thoughts about leadership? I think as a leader, I think you actually were a really good leader, because your team, when you had the maternity leave, they wanted to follow you, work you. So they wanted to do that for you.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's perhaps you can put it as a Native American better, but
Sure.
This what is a great leadership. But I would like to hear a bit.
Yeah. In terms of enabling the teams to take risks, I think that our reality a lot of times right now is that we can't make risks our main line of business. We have to create enough stability so that risks can be taken in more measured pieces. And that's why I talked about sort of innovation camps and opportunities to give your team something to more freely explore in their space. An example from Plants vs. Zombies, we had probably every 2 months or so, we spent a week on the question of what would you do if you could do anything with this product, which was already live. And so what we were doing 90% of our time was, of course, maintaining the live product, creating additional content for it, keeping up the stability, and serving the player requests. But what we did with the rest of that 10% of time was just explore what our personal dreams and hopes were for the product. And we all got together, we all reviewed them together. Some of them even made it into the game in the end, and some of them didn't, but we all respected that it was a way to express our passion for what we were doing without necessarily taking a lot of time for the question of just taking a big innovation risk and leap and investing a lot of time and resources into it. So I think making space for that, building it into your plan is good. There are other ways to encourage innovation in a sort of a safer space, but that's the one that sort of comes to mind in this case.
And we have another question.
So along the same lines, you talked about service teams and empowering them to say no and how we shovel work at them. Can you explain maybe techniques in which you make time for innovation in service teams?
So in making time for innovation on service teams, actually, so the Plants vs. Zombie example is a good one because it kind of was a service team, not a central service team, but it was a live operations team with a very regular cadence of requests that came through kind of a Kanban style board of operational updates. But another thing that I did see was the same sort of techniques applied on a central service team, which, if you think about it, it's a little bit harder to convert those necessarily to the end product. You might not have enough time to create a useful MVP or prototype of it, but instead, this team often wrote specs that were reviewed, and then at the next cycle, basically, they chose 4 or 5 of their favorite specs as a team, and then they put together an actual MVP or prototype project of that type. So they went through almost a sort of a 2-cycle review process where it enabled them to decide what they wanted to dedicate their time to in the next cycle and then execute on it. So the idea of a service team innovating still requires you to have that reserved time, and that can be a hard argument to make to your customers. But again, that's a bit about saying no at some points. There is you need to trust those teams to be able to make the decision to say, we're going to reserve a piece of our bandwidth for basically our team's mental health and ability to engage with the product and stay innovative and stay feeling like we are being core developers sometimes rather than just service people. So I think it is important to encourage those teams to feel more empowered, and the idea of reserving innovation time can be a useful tool there.
And we have another question. I think we have time left only for 2 questions.
Okay.
Hi. I was just wondering, the reality sometimes is that if we have a mixed environment where we have multiple teams because it's a very large project,
Yep.
and we're able to do this kind of thing in some teams, but that's not the entire ecosystem you're operating in. I think that's a kind of more of a realistic kind of scenario. Can you make that work? Because it seems like it's very frustrating when you're in a situation where you don't have that across all your teams. And is that manageable?
When you don't have sort of the tactics and that type of thing. Yeah, it is difficult. It's definitely difficult. However, I think by sort of living that example, you can show other teams that there are perhaps advantages to it and hopefully evangelize for the benefits that you're getting from it. If you're not getting benefits from it, you can't evangelize it, but you probably also shouldn't. So the idea here is that start by trying it and then demonstrate your best practices to the other teams and see if you can get them on board, because agreed, it can be very difficult when you have some teams who are in that space and some teams who are not. Nevertheless, you can operate that way, and especially if you're doing it with the goal of demonstrating how it can be done better. Probably if there are other large teams on other large projects, they could benefit from some of these same approaches as well. So hopefully that's something that we can sort of bring out to the rest of those teams.
Thank you. And the last question to Lorien.
Hi, my name is Nick from Wargaming Chicago. Earlier you talked about finding the right work. What processes did you work through to help identify what is the right work for the teams at hand?
Yeah, it's a tough one because the hope is that the tactical process enables us to start with a solution-based idea, something that is outcome-based, described from the player's point of view or the customer's point of view as appropriate. And we test that theory. We do not assume that this solution is the solution. We hopefully start with multiple hypotheses and refine in order to get to the point where we're confident before we begin spending massive development resources against it. So finding the right work is that very process. We are looking at potentials, which we think all have value as perhaps the solution that we need, and then we go through the initial vetting process. We review specifications, we talk about requirements, we move it through a pipeline or a funnel, if you like, with multiple stages of review, including architecture and business evaluation, that then allows us to say, yes, we spent more time up front pre-development on the thing, but in the end, that's less expensive and less taxing on our team for sure if we can come to the end of that process and say with confidence, this tactic is the one that is the most promising, or these 3 tactics are the ones that are the most promising in this case. So I think it's important to kind of go through a longer pre-production cycle with these tactics and evaluate them more carefully, and then take that into the next stage and allow the team then to continue the evaluation process through development, but they start with a higher level of confidence, and therefore the team is more trusting of the producer, designer, director, what have you. And so that process that I described, I think, is the way that I would go about suggesting the tactical refinement.
Thank you, Lorien. Well, that was the last question, and that was the great speech. Thank you.